One of the main legacies of Eleanor Roosevelt was the Greenbelt towns, and this came from an act of the federal government that was commissioned by Franklin D. Roosevelt, called the Greenbelt towns, and it came under a way of many actions to bring about changes to get America on the move again, referred to as the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act, and it also linked with the National Industrial Recovery Act. So the point was in 1935 there was a national recession. The idea was that one could put together a whole series of forces to retrain people, rehouse people, and what we have talked about previously of the garden cities and the beginnings of those principles could link together also with forms of the Radburn philosophy. So here developed this central principle also of the grouping in a series of neighborhood units. So there was quite a lot of looking at the precedents that had been at work, and partly it was influenced by Rex Tugwell, who became really the driving force of trying to bring about the first approach towards Greenbelt towns for America. So the Act had many very, very clever parts to it. Work, job skills, good planning, low rental housing, healthy communities, and was essentially administered by the Roosevelt Resettlement Administration, which meant that it could act really quite quickly. So in looking at this, obviously they looked firstly at the Radburn principle, which we've discussed, but they were really bringing about more in terms of this document that they produced. Notice on the cover of the document that it's using again an organic form. So once again our discussion between the natural and the orthogonal, and again you can see this demonstrated in one of their rather unusual graphics, which is showing abstracts of the orthogonal city with this new organic community that would be healthy and full of fruit and vegetables, of course, and between you can begin to get the hint of factories. So here is, I think, one of the key diagrams, maybe almost a key diagram of the 20th century, where this dialogue, this difficulty of the relationship between the city, which was suffering from suburban growth that it didn't enjoy and thought was reckless, laissez-faire, the onslaught of the automobile on the one hand. It was also suffering from decline of rural areas, so it got in-migration, so you got suburban shantytowns as they saw them, and you got at the same time inner city blighted areas. So here we look to the diagram to the right, and I think this again becomes perfectly obvious, and you can once again see how clear this is in terms of the garden city ideal, and how we have a series of satellites that are linked around the inner city, and how these new towns could therefore access peripheral factories in the city. It could also be collecting farm products, and these would be the new communities. So again, this, I think, pretty wholesome, interesting diagram that people could be commuting from the inner city to the new industrial areas. Remember, the first of the moves towards cleaner industry was beginning to take place prior to the Second World War. Manufacturing was getting cleaner. Also, you could get a relationship between farms and the city, and the green belts would be part of this wholesome movement. So here we're firstly looking at their drawing for Greenbelt, Maryland, designed in 1935. It was planned to be near industry, but in fact, in many cases, it wasn't necessarily near to industry. It was the first of the Greenbelt towns. It's 13 miles, almost due north of Washington, D.C. And here the Resettlement Administration appropriated 3,300 acres. These were purchased at agricultural prices. And you can see the layout, which is perhaps somewhat unusual. You could turn it to the orthogonal for a moment, and you could see that it's actually a series of neighborhood units. So you could see here a neighborhood unit as they described it. And it could have been done with straight lines, but it's on the slight serpentine move of the settlement. So here we have a neighborhood, second neighborhood unit, a third neighborhood unit. And the idea behind the neighborhood unit was that it would be a social hub, a meeting hub of people, a place for children to play in safety and in green. But at the same time, following the Radburn principle, you'd be able to navigate this space really quite easily. So if you look closely at this diagram, you can see a network of trails that are going through, essentially focused on children. Here we have a road bridge, and you can cut through at any point. So you've got two systems at work, as we've seen previously. We've got this network of safety routes to get to school, to get to the shops, to get to the community centre, all incredibly important. That is linking the neighbourhood units together. The neighbourhood units become essentially traffic-free hubs. The limited amount of car travel that was anticipated would go again into peripheral garage courts. We saw this example at Baldwin Hills. And now look at the amount of green space around, and the fact that in the green spaces you can see huge amount of allotment gardens. So the principle being, people would have, if we go right back to Owen, the idea of a 7-7-7 week, where the 7 hours of recreation would be wholesome in terms of being able to be in this parkland setting, go to the lake. A school would be a very different entity for helping children grow up, but fruit and vegetables would be very much part of this lifestyle. You'll also notice in looking at these early diagrams that it's using a fairly straightforward row housing. So this is very basic, very affordable housing that is being proposed. And when we first look at this, at the time that it had been pretty well scraped bare, it wasn't great land, you can see something that really isn't particularly inviting. What is really quite interesting here is, even though this is an early photograph, look at the contrast between flat roofs with these apartments, which these have the ability, the access to these community facilities. So the community facilities are through this area. You can see the footpaths going under the road in these locations. Here again, we have the flat roofs coming through, but you see already they're questioning the flat roof, and they're beginning to put on pitch roofs because they thought that they didn't leak. Quite the patterning of how they move between this flat roof one becoming a pitch roof. They never intended the pitch roof originally because this was American modernism. And so in this modernism, there'd be a parking court, the car would be entirely separated. This would over time become this lush green space, and you would have access to these
Science
growing
takes
gardens.
flight at last for human goals. This new age builds a better kind of city, close to the soil once more, as molded to our human wants as planes are shaped for speed. New cities take form, green cities. They're built into the countryside. They're ringed with trees and fields and gardens. New cities are not allowed to grow and overcrowd beyond the size that makes them fit for living in. The new city is organized to make cooperation possible between machines and men and nature. Each has his place. The sun and air and open green are part of the design. Safe streets and quiet neighborhoods are not just matters of good luck. They're built into the pattern and built to stay there. Power flashes from pitheads or rapid streams across the region. It flows from powerhouses to the sunlit factories and laboratories. Here, science serves the worker and the work together, making machines more automatic and the men who govern them more human. Factories are set apart from living quarters, but close to rail and motor roads, with space to spread about in. Light industries are near at hand. The heavy ones are set apart. People can even walk to work and have their lunch at home sometimes, just like the kids. This is no suburb where the lucky people play at living in the country. This kind of city spells cooperation, wherever doing things together means cheapness or efficiency or better living. Each house is grouped with other houses close to the school, the public meeting hall, the movies, and the markets. Around these green communities, a belt of public land preserves their shape forever. The children need the earth for playing and growing. Bringing the city into the country. Bringing the parks and gardens back into the city. Never letting cities grow too big to manage. Never pushing the meadows, fields, and woods too far away. This works as well for modern living as once it did in old New England towns. live a decent kind of life. We fathers have a little time to watch our kids and play with them. They see us in the daytime. The people who laid out this place didn't forget that air and sun are what we need for growing, whether it's flowers or babies. Just watch us grow. The scales won't hold us soon. You can't tell where the playing ends and where the work begins. We mix them here. We learn by living. Playgrounds, schools, libraries are meant for everyone. Even the washing needn't break a woman's back. Machines can take it. And the wife needn't feel cooped up and lonely on washing day. A little gossip or a friendly hand is good for the complexion. The daily marketing's part of the fun. In fact, the market's just an annex to the kitchen. Another chance to chat about the children's measles or the weather, or some new wrinkle in the diet that Grandma never knew. One thing is sure. Most of the greens brought in by truck from nearby farms each morning are fresh and crisp and haven't lost their flavor or their youth. In this new scheme of things, the school becomes the center and the focus of activities. Here, boys and girls live and relive the life around them, getting the measure of our bigger world and shaping it anew. City and school and land, in active partnership, provide the raw materials for life and growth. Here, boys and girls achieve a balanced personality, ready to build and meet a many-sided world, facing the good and bad, choosing the best. You take your choice. One is real, each one is possible. Shall we sink deeper in old grooves, paying for blight with human misery? Or have we vision? Have we courage? Shall we build and rebuild our cities, clean again, close to the earth, open to the sky? Can we afford a house, a neighborhood, a city as good as this for everyone? Maybe the question is, can we afford all this disorder? The hospitals, the jails, reformatories, the wasted years of childhood. These are future citizens, voters, lawmakers, mothers, fathers. You take your choice. Each one is real, each one is possible. Order has come. Order and life together. We've got the skill, we've found the way. We've built the cities. All that we know about machines and soils and raw materials and human ways of living is waiting. We can reproduce the pattern and better it 1,000 times. It's here, the new city, ready to serve a better age. You and your children, the choice is yours.
So I think we can see from that the heady prose political style of this movement, and you can work out where you lie on this path. I think it's fair to say on the negative side that this experiment was extremely limited. It did not bring about, there's a newspaper article discussing it, it did not bring about the level of a new America that we expected. On the other hand, you could look at it and say, look at how many values were encompassed in this that we're now beginning to re-examine. One of the things you may have singly noticed was the lack of ethnic diversity, but I think it's quite important when you look at Greenbelt now. It's actually 30% white, 47% African American, 9.7% Asian, and 14.3% Latino. So in terms of certain aspirations of what America might become, you could say that it developed a lot of insights at a very different type of time rather of American evolution, but still with really quite limited result. At the same time, we're seeing what probably you and I would refer to as a form of gentle modernism, of new technologies coming into play, a new look to the architecture and the buildings, the role of the school as being central to the neighborhood, and the idea of community space. And I think we would agree in a certain light. We often look at this work and think of, and probably we will be looking at this in more Central Europe, and yet here it is with a stripped down modernism done on an extreme budget, and in particular this is a DIY scheme. This is built by crews to give them skilled work as a means to get them back to work. One that I think is perhaps a little less known, a little less successful at the same time was Green Hills, Cincinnati. This worked more in terms of, you can see in this diagram, which I won't go into, but the idea that you would get more difference in living units with a lot of emphasis on more single living units as well as duplexes, as well as row housing. And the idea, which we're going to see shortly when we look at the private new town in America, that you could get the affordable urban cottage. So you could look at this and you could say, well, was it the difference between Washington, D.C. and Cincinnati, Ohio, that it's trying to mediate in a sense and say, well, couldn't we do this with affordable minimal housing? And so I move on to the third one, the other one I'm going to show today, which I've very much enjoyed doing a field visit to. This is Greendale, Milwaukee. As you can see, it's outer Milwaukee. It's very much on a radon burn principle. You can see in this as a cul-de-sac form coming in, and they're trying to do it largely with a minimum house, a house that forms to a unit pattern throughout. And you can see in this diagram, this seems more ordered perhaps than we've seen so far, but we're seeing very much in it the idea that you've got a row house in one part down these motor courts, as they often call them, or motorways, but also the development of the single, very, very small minimum house, a house that you could add on to. So here we're seeing in the public sector two forms in these different cul-de-sacs, one of grouped housing, one of single housing in Greendale, each relatively equal successful. We're going to look at them in a moment as they are not quite now, but a few years ago. And you can see it's not taking away the automobile. This is a compromise in it, but it's saying at the end of the road, you walk through here and you're walking into a green belt. So here we've got what I would often refer to as rationalized traditional. In other words, a factory has come much more into play, but it's really not an avant-garde house. It's a much more conservative gesture. So here they are made, a lot of uniformity, but here we've got, I think, the beginning, and look at the dimension of the road, how tight this is. But we've got the beginnings of a movement which often later is referred to as the core house. In other words, you start off with a core, but you show people over time how it can be embellished with having a loggia, an outbuilding. You can put in dormers, and so over time you can move from this core house. And lo and behold, if we're looking at it much more recently, I forgot when I took these photographs, but you can see sort of people's desires in life, the faux shutters that aren't really necessary, the sidings that have come in, but also the amount of growth of foliage, very minimal standards of the road that is hardly a passing road, which seems to be a good saving, and more limited on the roads, very tight sidewalk. But again, a minimum. Here we are into row housing, all of which seem to have developed quite well. And we're looking here along this cul-de-sac and into the greenway system. So here I am at the other end of that. I'm now standing in the greenway. The road has ended and you're getting a rather compact settlement. So what do I want to say about this briefly and in summary? I think overall this is something of a failed experiment. Who knows whether it's the fact that America beginning to get moving again and the ambitions of America began to change. And when we begin to look at Levittown, you probably see why I think there was perhaps a psychology at work that maybe wasn't going to favour this, what could be viewed as a type of progressive socialist new town. On the other hand, here we have in Greendale 14,000 people living today quite happily in 6,294 housing units, a really quite successful town. And there's no real reason why this federal strategy could not have continued. It was, in a way, a breakthrough in terms of affordable homes. Why? Firstly, the architecture is not trying to be a bold new adventure in architecture, and probably most architects dismissed it, but there could have been the beginnings of a minimal house movement that could have come out of this. But of course, the big saving was the land and the fact that you could have good transit between here and the city centre. This could have good development of agriculture. It could be ecologically based, and it could have worked very closely alongside an industrial strategy of the location of new industry. And one can only regret that this wasn't seen early as being a real possibility, but I think it was largely a sign of the times, that there was a move beginning to take place in America, that if you were truly American, you tended to, if you could, work more with the private marketplace than you would in this manner.